Welcome back everyone to Fazbear Fright. This is book 2, Fetch, and well, I don't really have anything to say. If you liked the first book, which I know a lot of you did, Fetch is, I said this book to you in the comments, but it's a lot better, also a lot darker, and a bit longer as well, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to split it into 2 parts this time. It's going to be 3 parts for each story, which... yeah, so I'm going to start right now. I don't really have much to say. The first story, obviously, is called Fetch, and there's a very creepy picture here. I don't know if you can see it, but, yeah, that picture, I think, says this story, what this story is about perfectly. It's very dark, the darkest so far, so let's get into it. The surf, the wind, and the rain were at war, battering against the old building so forcefully, Greg wondered if its crumbling walls could stand against them. When the bawling thunder blasted the boarded-up window again, Greg jumped back, stumbling into Cyril and tromping on his foot. Ow! Cyril shoved Greg, jabbing his flashlight spastically at the wall in front of them. The light scanned over drooping sections of blue-striped wallpaper and what looked like 2 red letters. F.R. Streaks of something dark sprayed over the stripes. Was that pizza sauce or something else? Haiti laughed at his 2 bumbling friends. It's just the wind, guys. Suck it up. Another gust hit the building, and the walls shuddered, drowning out Haiti's voice. The rain pounding on the metal roof ratcheted up, but inside the building, close by, something metallic clinked, loud enough to be heard over the wind and rain. What was that? Cyril whirled and swung his flashlight in a wild arc. At barely 13, Cyril was a year younger than Greg and Haiti, though still in their fledgling freshman class. He was short and skinny, with boyish features and limp brown hair, and he had the misfortune of sounding like a cartoon mouse. It didn't win him many friends. Let's go check out the old pizzeria, Cyril mimicked Greg's suggestion. Yeah, this was a great idea. It was a crisp autumn night, and the seaside town was dark, robbed of power by the latest storm's assault. Greg and his friends had planned a Saturday night of gaming and junk food, but as soon as the power went out, Haiti's parents tried to recruit them for a board game. The family tradition during power outages. Haiti had convinced his parents to let the boys bike the short distance to Greg's house, where they could play one of Greg's new tabletop strategy games instead. But once there, Greg enlisted them to go to the pizzeria. For days he'd known he had to do this. It was like he was drawn to this place. Or maybe he had it wrong. This could be a wild goose chase. Greg shined his flashlight around the corridor. They'd just explored the kitchen of the abandoned restaurant and had been shocked to find it was still stocked with pots, pans, and dishes. Who closed a pizzeria and left all that stuff behind? After they left the kitchen, they found themselves next to a large stage at one end of what had once been the main eating area of the derelict pizzeria. A heavy black curtain at the back of the stage was drawn closed. None of the boys had volunteered to see what was behind the curtain, and none of them had mentioned seeing it move when they passed the stage. Haiti laughed again. Better than hanging out with the fam. Hey, what's that? What's what? Cyril aimed his light in the direction of Haiti's gaze. Greg turned his flashlight that way, too, toward the far corner of the large, table-filled room they stood in. The glowing beam landed on a row of hulking shapes lined up along a murky glass counter. Bright eyes reflected the light back at them from across the room. Cool, Haiti said, kicking aside a broken table leg as he made his way toward the counter. Maybe, Greg thought, frowning at the eyes, one pair seemed to be staring right at him. Despite the confidence he'd felt before, he was beginning to wonder what exactly he was doing here. Haiti approached the counter first. This is dope. He reached for something and sneezed when dust billowed up from the stand. Before they left the house, Greg had suggested they all take handkerchiefs to cover their noses and mouths, but he couldn't find any. He expected to find the empty restaurant filled with dust, mold, mildew, and who knew what else. Surprisingly, given the wet coastal climate, the only decay they had seen was dust, but there was a lot of dust. Greg stepped around an overturned metal chair and past Cyril, who had his back pressed to a dirty, paint-peeled pillar in the middle of the dining room. Other than one broken table and two upside-down chairs, the area looked like it just needed a heavy cleaning before it could be fit for diners, which, again, was strange. Greg had known something would be here, but he didn't expect the building to still hold dishes and furniture and... what else? Greg looked at what Haiti held, and he sucked in his breath. Was this what he'd come for? Was this what the old place was calling to him? "What is it?" Cyril asked, not moving any closer to the counter. "I think it's a cat." Haiti turned the lumpy, roughly furred object he held. Or maybe a ferret? He poked at whatever it was. Might be an animatronic. He put it down and shined his light over the other shapes along the counter. "Yeah, awesome. They're prizes, see?" Haiti scanned his light over the stiff figures. That explained the cave-like cubbyholes that lined the broad hallway Greg and his friends had come through to get to the dining area. The little enclosures must have been for arcade cabinets and game booths. "I can't believe these are still here," Haiti said. "Yeah." Greg frowned, studying what looked like a stiffened sea otter and a tangled octopus. Why were they still here? The old pizzeria had stood, boarded up and bombarded by coastal storms and sea air for who knew how long. The structure was clearly abandoned, and it looked not just old, but ancient, on the verge of collapse. The graying, weathered siding was so faded, you could barely tell what it was. The name of the pizzeria was long gone. So why did it look so good on the inside? Well, not good exactly, but from where Greg stood, the building looked sturdy enough to stand another 100 years. Greg and his parents had moved to the small town when he was in first grade, so he knew the place well, but he didn't really understand it. For example, he'd always thought it was strange that a boarded-up pizzeria had been left untouched in what was supposed to be a vacation spot. But then again, this wasn't exactly a swanky resort town. Greg's mom called it a hodgepodge. Big, fancy homes could be found across the street from tiny, ugly beach cabins, draped in dirty fishing floats and surrounded by piles of old lumber or crumpled lawn furniture. The house across from Greg's had a huge, boxy sedan, like from the 70s, up on blocks in the front yard. Still, Greg wondered why a pizza place couldn't be turned into something useful, instead of being left a gnarled old ghost building that practically screamed break-in to local kids. But, weirdly, it didn't look like anyone had broken in before Greg and Cyril and Haiti did. Greg had figured they'd find footprints, trash, graffiti, evidence that other explorers had been here before them. But nothing. It was like the place had been abandoned, dipped in formaldehyde, and preserved until Greg suddenly felt like he was supposed to come here. "I bet these are still here because they're the really good prizes," Haiti said. "No one ever wins the good prizes," Cyril piped up. He had edged a little closer to the counter, but he was still several feet away. "There aren't any clowns, Cyril." Greg had to assure Cyril that there wouldn't be any clowns in the abandoned restaurant in order to convince Cyril to come along. Not that Greg knew one way or the other. "What's that one?" Cyril pointed at a large-headed figure with a big nose. It sat under a sign that read, "Top Prize." Greg picked it up before Haiti could. It was heavy, and its fur felt matted and coarse. He was oddly drawn to the animal, whatever it was. He studied the pointed ears, sloped forehead, long snout, and piercing yellow eyes. Then he noticed the blue collar around the animal's neck. Something gleaming dangled from the collar. A dog tag? He lifted it. "Fetch," Haiti read over Greg's shoulder. "It's a dog named Fetch." Greg loved dogs for the most part, but he hoped never to see something like this in real life. He held the dog up and turned it this way and that. Even the vicious old dog that lived next door to Greg wasn't this ugly. Fetch looked like someone had crossed the big bad wolf with the shark from Jaws. Surely it was a he, head was a triangle, pointy on top and with a mouth far too wide for comfort at the bottom. Fetch's fur, which looked grayish-brown in the splotchy glow of their flashlights, was missing in places, revealing tarnished metal underneath. A couple of wires stuck out of the big ears, and a partially exposed cavity in Fetch's belly revealed what looks like a primitive circuit board. "Look at this," Cyril was, surprisingly, now interested in the counter. He picked up a small booklet inside a plastic sheath. "I think it's the instructions." "Let me see." Greg plucked the booklet from Cyril's grasp. "Hey," Cyril squeaked. Greg ignored his protests. This could be it. Putting Fetch back on the counter, he pulled the booklet from the plastic and scanned through the instructions. Haiti read over his shoulder. Cyril stuck his head between Greg's chest and the booklet, forcing Greg to hold the booklet farther out so they could all read together. Fetch, the instructions explained, was an animatronic dog designed to sync up with your phone and retrieve information and other things for you. That's lit, Haiti said. Think it still works? How long has this place been empty? Greg asked. Fetch looks like he's older than my dad, but smartphones haven't been around for that long. Haiti shrugged. Greg finally did too, and he began poking around Fetch to find the control panel. Haiti and Cyril lost interest. It isn't going to work. It's older tech, so it won't be compatible with our phones, Cyril said, cringing when the wind surged against the building again. Greg felt a chill slither down his spine. Whether it was related to the wind's eerie onslaught or something else, he wasn't sure. Greg returned his attention to Fetch. He wanted to see if he could get the dog thing to do whatever it was supposed to do. He had a hunch this might be what he'd felt in the field, what had called him here. Cyril's pessimism about Fetch didn't surprise Greg. He wouldn't know an opportunity if it thumped him between the eyes. Haiti, on the other hand, was relentlessly positive. He had such a sunny disposition, he'd pulled off what Greg thought was nothing less than a magic trick. Haiti was accepted by the popular crowd, despite having spent most of his time with Cyril and Greg, two of the nerdiest kids in school. Maybe it had something to do with his looks. Greg had heard girls talking about Haiti. Haiti wandered around the counter, and Cyril plopped down in a chair at the nearest table. I think we should go, he said. Nah, Haiti brushed him off. There's still a lot to check out. Greg ignored them both. He picked up Fetch and found a panel under Fetch's belly. Juggling the instructions, Fetch and his flashlight, Greg bit his lip and concentrated on hitting the right buttons in the right sequence. For an instant the wind and rain let up, leaving the building in a silence that felt almost menacing. Greg glanced up at the ceiling. He noticed a large stain above his head. A water stain? Distracted from his task for a second, he shined his light over the whole ceiling. No other stains. In fact, why wasn't the whole inside of the restaurant dripping? He thought he'd seen part of the metal roof missing when he'd first looked at the building. Why wasn't it leaking? Shrugging, he returned his attention to Fetch. At this point, he was just randomly pushing buttons. None of the sequences laid out in the instructions were doing anything. As abruptly as it had stopped, the wind and rain started up again in a crescendo of maniacal drumming, pounding, and wailing. That's when Fetch moved. Suddenly, with a whirring sound, Fetch's head raised. Then his gaping, tooth-filled mouth opened, and he growled. What the hell? Greg dropped Fetch on the counter and leaped back. Simultaneously, Cyril erupted from his chair. What? Haiti asked, returning to his friends. Greg pointed at Fetch, whose head and mouth were in clearly different positions than they had been when they'd found him. Sick, Haiti said. They all stared at Fetch, edging backward in unspoken agreement that a little distance was a good idea in case Fetch did something else. They waited. So did Fetch. Haiti got bored first. He shined his flashlight in the direction of the stage. What do you think is behind that curtain? I think I don't want to know, Cyril said. Behind them, a door slammed, inside the building. As a unit, the boys ran through the dining room and down the hall to the storage room they'd broken into. Even though he was the smallest, Cyril reached the room first. He was out through the narrow gap they'd managed to create in the jammed service door opening before the other boys could squeeze through. Outside, pelted by rain streaking sideways, they grabbed their bikes. Greg figured the wind was gusting over 50 miles per hour now. No way could they bike home. He looked at Haiti, whose curly black hair was matted against his head. Haiti burst out laughing, and Greg joined in. Cyril hesitated, then started laughing too. Come on, Haiti shouted over the screaming wind. Without looking back at the restaurant, they put their heads down and pushed their bikes against the storm. As he trudged beside his friends, Greg thought about why he'd wanted them to come to the abandoned restaurant. They'd left so much of it unexplored, like the area behind the curtain. There'd been 3 closed doors off the hallway, too. What was behind them? Greg was afraid he might not have gotten what he was there for. Had he done what he was meant to do? Greg was close to home when a woman called out, "Wet enough for you?" He stopped, wiped his eyes, and squinted through the rain. "Hey, Mrs. Peters," he called, when he saw his elderly neighbor standing on her covered front porch. She threw up her skinny arms. "Love these storms," she sang out. He laughed and waved at her. "Enjoy," he shouted. She waved too, and he plodded on. When he neared his parents' tall, modern oceanfront house, Greg was surprised to see a light in the living room window. The town was still dark. When he'd parted with Cyril and Haiti, the only lights he'd seen were their flashlights bobbing along like disembodied spirits, and the flickers of what looked like candles inside a couple houses. The light in his window, however, was bright and steady. When he pulled his bike in next to the stilts that raised the house a full story off the ground, he discovered why he'd seen light. At first, drowned out by the thunderstorm sounds and the rain and wind, he hadn't heard the motor until he practically walked into it. A shiny new generator sat under the house, chugging away, a cord extending past the two-car garage and up the stairs to the front door. Greg peeled off his dripping rain jacket as he climbed the steps, but before he reached the front door, it opened. "There you are, boyo!" Greg's Uncle Darrin grinned down at him, his mountainous 6'5", broad-shouldered frame filling the doorway. "I was about to mount a search party. You didn't answer your phone." Greg reached the entry and exchanged his and his uncle's signature greeting, a half-hug double fist bump. "Sorry, Dare, I didn't eat it. I didn't hear it." He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped it. Dare had texted and called him multiple times. "Wow, I swear I didn't hear it." "Who could hear anything in this wind? Get inside." "Where'd the generator come from?" Greg asked. He didn't really care. He was trying to distract himself from thinking about why he didn't hear his phone in the restaurant. It hadn't been that loud inside. Could it have been because... "I got it in Olympia. Your dad's been saying for years you don't need it, but that's bull honky. I told him he's gonna wish he had one. They've been saying the storms will get much worse this winter. And wouldn't you know it, they came early this year. How about that rain we got last week for Halloween?" Dare shook his head. "Of course, your dad won't listen." Greg didn't remember that argument. But then, Darrin, Greg's dad, had so many arguments, how could he remember any specific one? Uncle Darrin was Greg's mother's brother, her only sibling, and they were close. Greg and Dare were even closer. But Greg's dad hated Dare for the very reasons Greg loved him, because Dare was flamboyant and fun. "Darrin needs to grow up," Greg's dad would say over and over. With long hair, dyed purple and worn in a braid, and a wardrobe of bright-colored suits and ties paired with painfully patterned shirts, Dare had his own distinct look. That Dare was also a wealthy, successful inventor of car parts and had the most amazing luck with investments and money in general was the nail in his coffin as far as Greg's dad was concerned. People like him don't deserve success, he often groused. Greg's dad was a contractor, and he worked more than he wanted to afford their big house and the expensive cars he liked. The fact that Dare lived on a 10-acre estate and made tons of money from tinkering in his workshop was too much. Greg loved Dare the way he wished he could love his dad. Dare had done nothing but accept Greg from the day his squished little head entered the world, despite the fact that Greg was never a cute baby, and he hadn't turned into a cute kid. His face was too long, his eyes were too close together, and his nose was too small. Never drawn to typical boy things like cars and sports, no matter how hard his dad tried to force them down his throat, Greg found an ally in Dare, who didn't question Greg's likes or dislikes. "Where's Mom?" Greg asked Dare. "Book club." Greg didn't ask about his dad. 1, he didn't care. 2, he knew his dad would be playing poker with his buddies. That was how he spent his Saturday evenings, even if he had to play cards by candlelight. "Where were you boys in this weather?" Dare asked. Can I keep that a secret?" Dare tilted his huge head and stroked his graying goatee. "Sure, I trust you." "Thanks." "You want to play a game?" Dare asked. "Can I take a rain check?" "Ha, good one. They need someone to watch him on Saturdays." "No way, his mom and I go way back. Maybe I'll stop by sometime and bring you guys a treat. Or bring my new puppy. I've been thinking seriously about getting a dog." "Really? Cool." "Yeah, a friend has a Shih Tzu that's going to have puppies soon. I'm thinking I've been without a dog long enough. I miss having one." Greg laughed. "Just be sure it's a nice Shih Tzu. I think the beast next door is part Shih Tzu." "That snaggletooth mongrel? Nah, no dog of mine will be like that. Remember," Dare said, holding up his right index finger, on which he wore his favorite ring. "I have..." "The magic finger of luck," they said in unison. They laughed. The magic finger of luck had been an ongoing joke since Greg was about 4 years old. One day Greg was crying because he wanted the stuffed octopus in the claw machine. He hadn't been able to get it when his mother put money in the machine, and he'd tried with the claw. Dare had tapped the glass of the claw machine with his right index finger, and had said in a deep voice, "I have the magic finger of luck, I will get you the octopus." And he had done it on the first try. After that, Dare called on the magic finger of luck to get things to go his way. It pretty much always worked. Greg stopped laughing, thinking again about the neighbor's dog. Yeah, I still can't believe that thing bit me. The neighbors next door had moved in the year before, and 2 days later their dog, a small but evil mutt with a very sharp teeth and one missing eye, charged out at Greg and bit him on the ankle. He had to have 10 stitches. "Okay, I'll go and leave you to your reading," Dare said. "Before I go, though, let's make sure everything's working right." 15 minutes later, Greg was lounging on his double bed, reading by the nice bright light of his red pendant reading lamp. Dare had gotten the family a power transfer system for the generator that hooked up to the breaker box. With the flip of a few switches, power was restored to the whole house. "Got this especially for your gaming needs," Dare said, before giving Greg another half-hug double fist bump and leaving. Even though he really wanted to get to his reading, Greg took the time to do his nightly yoga routine before sliding under the oversized Afghan Dare had knitted for him. Dare had also taught him yoga, and Greg loved it. It not only calmed him down before bed, it helped him stay in shape. Not that good shape was good enough. Greg's phone buzzed. He picked it up and looked at a text from Haiti. "You recovered?" Greg snorted, as if he was scared enough to need recovering. "From what?" he texted back, playing dumb. "You can't fool me." "Okay," Greg responded. "Yeah, I'm good. Need more courage, I guess." "You need Brian Reinhardt's brain. He's not afraid of anything." Greg laughed. "GG." Greg typed in, "Bye for now." He flopped on his bed. He picked up his journal and the book on the 0-point field he needed to check. He glanced over at his plants before he started reading. They were the key to this, weren't they? They made the exchange he just had with Haiti more than a silly game. Well, they were at least the catalyst. Learning about Cleve Baxter's experiments is what launched him down the road he was on. But the plants wouldn't help him tonight. He needed to review what he knew about random event generators, or REGs. He flipped through the book. Yes, there it was. Machines and Consciousness, Cause and Effect. He put the book down and skimmed his last journal entry. He hadn't misinterpreted what he'd gotten, had he? No, he didn't think so. He was either on the right track or he wasn't, and if he wasn't, he didn't think he wanted to know what track he was on. The way he'd been drawn to that place couldn't have been a coincidence. The storm hung around another day, but it fizzled out late Sunday night. Power came back on, school's in session as usual Monday morning. Greg endured the first half of the day, and was relieved when 1:10 p.m. finally rolled around and he got to go to Advanced Scientific Theory. Advanced Scientific Theory was an AP class, reserved for freshmen who had won science fair prizes in the previous 2 years. The class had only 12 students. It was taught by a visiting teacher, Mr. Jacoby, who also taught at Grays Harbor Community College. As always, Greg was the first one in the classroom. He sat in the front. Only Haiti was sitting near him. Mr. Jacoby was practically bouncing at the front of the yellow-walled classroom when the bell rang. Tall and lanky, but so full of energy he reminded Greg of a long-coiled spring, Mr. Jacoby was an enthusiastic teacher who was undaunted by disinterested students. Greg loved science, all science, not just tech, and his passion had earned him the title of teacher's pet. Mr. Jacoby always lectured while darting around the front of the classroom like he had bugs in his pants. Sometimes he scribbled on the whiteboard. More often he just rambled, but it was interesting stuff. This small room, filled with tall wooden lab tables and counter-height chairs, was one of Greg's favorite places in the school. He loved the periodic table and the constellation posters on the walls. He loved the smell of the fertilizer that fed the hybrid plants growing on the back of the room. It made him think of science and learning. Running a hand through unruly red hair, Mr. Jacoby began. In quantum physics, there's something known as the 0-point field. This field is scientific proof that there is no such thing as a vacuum, no such thing as nothingness. If you empty all space of matter and energy, you still find, in subatomic terms, a bunch of activity. This constant activity is a field of energy that's always in motion. Subatomic matter constantly interacting with other subatomic matter. Mr. Jacoby rubbed a freckled nose. Are you all with me? Greg nodded enthusiastically. Haiti, who sat next to him at the 3-person lab table, nudged him. Hey, this is your stick. Greg ignored him. Mr. Jacoby grinned at Greg and took his nod to represent the entire class, which was unwise, but Greg was fine with it. Good. Mr. Jacoby continued. So this energy is called the zero-point field because of fluctuations in the field are still found in temperatures of absolute zero. Absolute zero is the lowest possible energy state, where everything's been removed and there should be nothing remaining to make any motion. Make sense? Greg nodded again. Great. So the energy should be zero, but when they measure the energy, mathematically, it never actually reaches zero. There's always some remaining vibration due to continued particle exchange. Still with me? Greg nodded enthusiastically. He'd had no idea Mr. Jacoby was going to be talking about this today. What were the odds? He grinned. There were no odds. It was the field. He was so excited that he missed the next few minutes of Mr. Jacoby's lecture. It didn't matter. He knew this stuff. He did tune back in, though, when Kimberly Bergstrom raised her hand. Well, he sort of tuned back in. He heard her question, "Is this just theory?" He also heard the start of Mr. Jacoby's answer. Not entirely. Consider the scientific trend. Before the scientific revolution. That's where Greg turned out again. He got caught up in watching Kimberly. He felt himself flush, and he whipped his gaze away from Kimberly before someone caught him staring. Too late. Haiti nudged him again, and when Greg looked over, Haiti made goofy goo-goo eyes at him. Greg shifted his attention back to Mr. Jacoby. As usual, Greg was the last one out of the room when class was over. Mr. Jacoby smiled at him as Greg gathered his stuff, and Greg gave another thought to talking to his teacher. Then he felt his phone vibrate. Waving at Mr. Jacoby, Greg pulled out his phone as he stepped into the hallway. He looked at the screen. "Hello, Greg. HRU." The phone number wasn't familiar, and Greg looked around. Who was texting him? He entered. "I'm fine. Who's this?" Then he watched his screen. Fetch. "Oh, very funny, Haiti," Greg muttered. He texted what he said. The reply wasn't what he expected. "Question for you." "What's your question?" Greg texted. "Why'd you leave?" Greg rolled his eyes and entered. "You're hilarious." "Thank you. You answer." Greg felt a tap on his shoulder. "You're going to be late for Spanish, amigo," Haiti said. Greg whipped around. Haiti raised an eyebrow, and Cyril, who stood next to him, took a stutter step back. "Why are you texting me if you're right here?" Greg asked Haiti. "Dude, you act? Do I look like I'm texting you?" He wasn't going to talk about the texts now, but he didn't stop thinking about them either. If neither Haiti nor Cyril sent them, who did? Was someone else in the restaurant with the boys on Saturday night? Is that what the slamming door was? Or did someone see them leave, then go in and find Fetch? The idea that they'd been watched made Greg's skin crawl, but the idea that they hadn't been watched made all the hairs stand up on Greg's arms. Could it be? He wouldn't think about it, not yet. By the next day, he had been thinking about it, hard. In that time, he'd received a dozen texts from Fetch. By now, he realized the texts had to be from the animatronic. They couldn't be from anyone else, because no one else knew everything Fetch was texting about. Obviously, Fetch was dialed into Greg, so to speak. It quickly became clear that Fetch was synced with Greg's phone, and he was trying to live up to his name. When Greg told Cyril he needed more time to do his homework, Fetch sent Greg a link to some time management article, and a clock app appeared on Greg's phone. When Greg looked up REGs online, he received a link from Fetch to an article about the latest research into intention and REGs. When Greg finished the article, Fetch texted a bunch of zeros and ones. This baffled Greg until he thought about the article he just read. The article talked about the experiments being done that use REGs to measure whether a person could think hard enough to have an effect on an outcome in the physical world. Greg knew REGs generated random zeros and ones. Ones and zeros, Greg thought. Was it possible? Greg copied Fetch's text into a binary-to-text converter, and sure enough, Fetch had texted OK in binary code. Greg shivered as he texted back, OK. He wasn't sure it was okay at all. It was more spooky than okay. Then things got stranger, as if getting texts from an old animatronic dog wasn't bizarre to begin with. One day, Greg told his mom on the phone that he was craving chocolate. She said what she'd always said when he mentioned candy. "Not good for you. Have an apple." Later that day, when she got home from shopping, she pulled a chocolate bar out of the bag. "How'd this get here?" she said in annoyance, tucking her chin-length blonde hair behind an ear. "I didn't buy this." She checked her receipt and discovered the bar was on the order she'd placed online. Must be a glitch," she said. "I'll have to email them." When she caught Greg watching her, she said, "Well, it's your lucky day," and tossed him the bar. As he caught the candy bar, he was pretty sure he couldn't eat it yet. He was too excited. If he was right, Fetch had just fetched him a candy bar. What else could the animatronic dog do, and how was he doing it? Greg could accept, barely, that Fetch was synced with his phone. But Fetch wasn't synced with his mom's phone, was he? The text messages continued day after day. Sometimes Greg responded just because, sometimes not. Either way, he kept a log in his journal. This was giving him important feedback for his project. A lot of his exchanges with Fetch made no sense. Like the day Fetch texted, DDIS. "Why would I do anything stupid?" Greg responded. "Dunno." Sometimes the texts were clear. One day, Greg texted Cyril that he was having trouble for the Spanish homework, and he needed this translation for, "I don't know how to make banana bread without eggs or flour." Cyril didn't respond, but Fetch texted Spanish. Cyril didn't text back until late in the evening. When he did, his translation was the same as Fetch's. The exact same Spanish. Was it time for Greg to tell his friends what was going on? He decided to wait. But then came the spider.